A horrifying scene displays itself before the eyes of the Dauphin, as him and his father Louis XV of France walk the battlefield. The king, eager to show his son the price of glory, had taken him to the Belgian village of Fontenoy. The previous day, a British-Dutch army under the Duke of Cumberland was soundly beaten by the king's forces under Marshal de Saxe. The 15-year-old Dauphin gets awakened from his shocked silence when the soldiers accompanying them start loudly cheering. Marshal de Saxe, with glowing delight in his face, presents the king with the standard of a vanquished British regiment, exclaiming, "Your Majesty, I hand you victory." In October 1740, Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire, Archduke of Austria, King of Bohemia and Hungary, among other titles, had died without a male heir. His eldest daughter Maria Theresia inherited the vast Habsburg Empire, with the exception of the title of Holy Roman Emperor, as the Salic laws forbade women from inheriting the title. This was initially recognized by France among a few other European powers. It, however, sparked a conflict within the Holy Roman Empire, as some of the princes did not recognize Maria Theresia and her husband Franz Stephan, who was chosen to hold the title of Holy Roman Emperor. France was thus presented with an opportunity to dismember its age-old rival on the European stage by entering the war on the rebellious prince's side. A French entry into the War of Austrian Succession, however, would inevitably sabotage the carefully built diplomatic system of a balance of power France had established after the last Great War with the Grand Coalition. France had even managed to build amicable relations with the British. French foreign policy was also further occupied with a power struggle with the Russian Empire for influence over Poland, as they wanted their candidate Armand de Bourbon, Duke of Conti, to be elected as Polish king. Breaking its word would certainly harm France's diplomatic standing on the international stage. For Louis XV, however, the temptation was too great. He allied himself with the rebellious Elector of Bavaria, Charles VII, and entered the war on his side. Britain, fearing a massive French empire dominating the continent, entered the war on the side of the Habsburgs, thus sabotaging Franco-British relations permanently. Franco-Bavarian attempts, however, to topple the Habsburg monarchy failed, as the Allied forces were beaten back out of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1745, an Allied army had tried to attack France itself from the Austrian Netherlands. This attempt, however, ended in disaster at Fontenoy. In America, the war had wreaked havoc among the Anglo-American frontier. Native nations eager for loot and armed and supplied by their father, a term they used for their French allies, swarmed the frontier settlements, taking captives and scalps. This massive wave of raiding instilled a strong native and French-hating attitude in the Anglo-American colonies, which was only to intensify. The New England colony, on the initiative of Massachusetts, conducted their own campaign against New France, capturing Louisbourg in the same year as the Battle of Fontenoy had taken place. Also in this fateful year, a rising in Scotland seeking to restore the fallen Catholic Stuart monarchy on the throne of Great Britain shook the small country, capturing Edinburgh. Louis XV, eager to stick it to the British, funded their uprising and supplied it with weapons and ammunition. This uprising was ultimately defeated by government forces at the Battle of Culloden Moor. It, however, created a staunch anti-French sentiment in Britain bordering on paranoia. Despite their victory in Belgium, the French did not press their advantage and take the Austrian Netherlands in the peace treaty. The great trading post at Madras, which had also been taken by the French, was given back to the British in exchange for the return of Louisbourg. France thus achieved its goal of weakening Austria on the international stage. The victory, however, was a superficial one. The decision to attack Maria Theresia, despite promising not to, had isolated France and ruined its relations with Britain. The entry into the war also created a new German powerhouse, the Kingdom of Prussia, which annexed Silesia after the peace treaty. Louis XV's incoherent policymaking had also been a radical departure from his predecessor. A man sprawling with confidence, Louis XIV had been pursuing a stringent and coherent foreign policy. This, however, could not be said about Louis XV, as he dreaded confrontation and was plagued by low self-esteem and energy. Without a strong monarch like Maria Theresia or first minister like Newcastle, the French cabinet had devolved into a powder keg of personal rivalries and disjointed, incoherent policymaking, the blunder of entering the Austrian War of Succession being a direct result of this, as it pitched France against Britain. The French kingdom, although mighty and powerful, was not at all prepared for a full-scale war with its island neighbour. The French navy, a key factor in case of a confrontation with Britain, had been significantly sized down in order to cut expenses and to pay for the debts of various wars. Thus, despite the murder of Jumonville in the Ohio country in 1755, France had good reasons to try and solve the crisis diplomatically. Governor Duquesne, who had hoped for a full-scale confrontation with the Brits, thus had to be disappointed. All he could do is seek reckoning with Washington and the Mingos in the Ohio country. Such a reckoning he would get 5 weeks after the murder of Jumonville. Washington had meanwhile constructed a wooden fort at the Great Meadows called Fort Necessity. Tanaqueson had moved his encampment with his meager following of 80 Mingos, of which perhaps 30 were warriors, to the Great Meadows. Washington still did not quite understand the half-king's intention behind his cold-blooded murder of the envoy. Tanaqueson, in the wake of the French establishing themselves in the Ohio country, lost all support he had from the Ohio Valley natives. Thus he needed a strong ally of his own to wrestle back control. He assured Washington that the Delaware, Shawnee and remaining Mingos would flock to his banner if they heard the British were moving on Fort Duquesne. Shortly after, the Virginians and Mingos made for Fort Duquesne. A few miles north, they stopped to negotiate with the Delaware and Shawnee representatives. 5 days of negotiations with the tribes, however, revealed that they had been secretly dealing with the French and had no intention to switch sides. With no other option available, Tanaqueson and Washington turned back to Fort Necessity. The half-king, knowing that his game was up, left the Great Meadows after the negotiations. Washington, still confident of victory, made preparations to attack Fort Duquesne. On his way north, an Oneida chief rode into his camp, telling him that substantial French reinforcements were in the area. After receiving this message, Washington hurried back to Fort Necessity, with his men hastily preparing the fort for an assault. The day after he arrived back at the fort, 600 French soldiers and 100 Allied tribesmen came into sight, preparing to assault Washington's little wooden stockade. Rain was pouring down like hell on that day, which made the Virginians' muskets unusable as the gunpowder was wet. The French, in contrast, were shielded from the rain by the forest. Their commander gave the order to attack, and in a quick and brutal melee they stormed a small wooded hill overlooking the fort, and proceeded to rain hell over the defenseless Virginians. This one-sided shootout continued the whole day. By nightfall, the French fire ceased. On the first day of fighting, 30 Virginians were killed and 70 wounded, with the French taking almost no casualties. During the night, the rainfall continued, drenching the Virginians and their powder even further. Any semblance of discipline broke down as the militiamen broke into their own rum supply, with Washington helplessly watching his men getting drunk. The next day, it seemed, would end in total catastrophe for Washington, but then something unbelievable happened. The French commander de Villers offered to parley with Washington. Washington, gladly accepting this, did not know that the French had hastily marched to Fort Necessity and had only carried little ammunition. Thus he was permitted to surrender with the honors of war after a short negotiation. Him and his soldiers got to keep all their personal belongings and small arms. The regiments kept their colors and one single ceremonial cannon. All prisoners were exchanged and the Virginians and Washington returned home humiliated. What Washington didn't know, however, was that in the terms of capitulation he also confirmed with his signature that Jumonville had been on a diplomatic mission and thus admitted to murdering an envoy, embarrassing Virginia and also by extent King George, and handed the French all justification they needed. The British cabinet reacted to the fall of Fort Necessity with an alarm resembling panic. Newcastle himself, wanting to stave off war, preferred to negotiate with the French. He, however, was pitted against a strong war party headed by the Duke of Cumberland, a man who was also called the Butcher for his violent handling of the Jacobite rising, a man itching for revenge for Fontenoy, a man who was convinced that any problem could be solved with a musket and a bayonet.